Today we're going to talk to you about what it's like working with product managers and designers. We'll do quick introductions of ourselves. So starting off, my name is Christine Yoon, and I am currently a design manager at LinkedIn. I've been at the company for almost 4 years now, and I manage a team of 5 designers, and I work on a product called Pages. So if you're unfamiliar with that, basically what that is like if you looked up a company or a school on LinkedIn, it's like their version of a profile, so you can find information about that organization or jobs. Additionally, just a little bit about my background. So before I broke into design, I actually studied business in my undergrad. And I worked at Deloitte Consulting for 5 years doing like technology consulting before I officially decided to pivot fully into UX design, in which I decided to do that by getting a master's in interaction design at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. So after that, I started working at LinkedIn, and that's been my journey. I'll pass it off to Kevin to introduce himself now.
Hey all, my name is Kevin. I'm a senior designer at LinkedIn. I've been there for a little over 3 years now, actually, and I work broadly in what's called the content experience team, and specifically the live video feature. So a lot of what I do is think about how we can bring or have broadcasters bring people, their audience together, and how they can interact with each other in real time. Before that, I was at Google working on Google Maps. And then prior to that, doing more startup work and a little agency life. So a little bit of everything. I think my background also has been in New York. I went to FIT. I was actually just catching up on that. And yeah, I've been here, like I said, for about 3 years. It's been great. Yeah, I'll just hand it off to Jay.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm the only non-designer, it seems like, on the call. I'm the product manager at LinkedIn. I've been here for about 3 years. I manage the audiences and measurement teams. So these are platform organizations that help marketers connect with the people they want to reach, to onboard their data, to run campaigns, and ultimately measure their success, whether it's to hire people or to market their products and services. Prior to LinkedIn, I was at Google as well, not on the same team as Kevin, unfortunately, and a slew of small startups. And if you actually look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll realize quickly that I had a completely different career a while ago in the sciences, molecular biology, public health, public policy. And if you think it takes a long time to ship a feature, try shipping a bill or a law. So you can understand why I might have made that change, but happy to go into that some other time. Excited to be here for the talk. And Antonio?
Yeah, nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Antonio, and I'm an associate UX designer at LinkedIn. I'm in actually the same team as Kevin, content experience team, but I'm on the news track. So that means designing for news experiences in LinkedIn, such as when you log into LinkedIn desktop today, you see the little right rail with the LinkedIn news column. That's one of the many things that we do. And I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University this year and did information systems and human computer interactions double major for my undergrad. Before working at LinkedIn, I interned at LinkedIn as well last year. And then before that, I was at PayPal and Venmo as design interns as well. Super excited to talk to you, everyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for the intro. And like I said, we want to try to keep this casual too. So if you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the Zoom. We'll definitely have a couple of questions and activities that we can do as a group together to make this fun too. But we'll also save Q&A at the end as well. So feel free to chime in as you have questions as we go along. All right, so what we're going to cover today. So basically, what we want to start with giving an overview of what is product management. I think a lot of you are familiar with what designers do since you're all studying design right now. But a lot of questions we get from students is like, well, how does design work together with product managers, particularly as it pertains to shipping product? So we'll start off with covering that. And then we'll talk about the overlap between PM and design, because I think that's also a lot of confusing points sometimes where people are like, well, designers do this, but PMs also do this. So where do we overlap in our responsibilities? Lastly, we'll just end with some practical tips in terms of how to effectively collaborate with your product manager partners and others that you're working with on the team. And we'll go into Q&A from there. All right, so now I'm going to hand it off to Jay to cover more about the PM overview.
So for the first question I want to ask is, what do you think a PM actually does? Feel free to use the Zoom chat if you guys want to enter in there. Otherwise, you can certainly unmute yourself. We'd love to hear what you guys think a PM actually does. I should note you're not getting graded on this, so there is technically no wrong answer. Feel free to blurt anything.
So I can go. I mean, PM technically is responsible for collaborating closely with, I would say the business stakeholder, marketing stakeholder to, synthesize as to what is required for product, setting the product goals, and then, translating that as a requirement to the designers, being the bridge essentially.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikhil. Other folks?
Also, they organize and figure out the deadlines, I assume.
Cool. Thanks, Priya. Other thoughts?
I think probably like make plan for designers and engineers in the team. Tell them how to do the work by specific content.
Cool. So if there's any other answers, feel free to block them in. But like Christine mentioned, this is an interactive conversation. This is not just a presentation at you guys. Clicking it to the next one. Christine, do you actually want to give me control?
I don't have that setting right now for some reason. So
okay. No worries.
Yeah.
All good. So all those definitions are totally right. I'm really glad that no one said it. PM is a person that pushes people around, tells them what to do. Really just that comes up very often. The other thing that people often say is like it's the person that keeps the timetable. Like here's the plan. I'm just gonna help you get organized because that's a project manager. Not that that's not a part of a product manager, but it's a little bit bigger than that, right? And the reason why I say it's all right is because it's someone who owns the product strategy, defines then the requirements, and then brings those features or products to market. So it's exactly what you guys mentioned, but it's a more holistic sense of what we mean by a product manager. So next slide. So if you take that definition and you look at the stakeholder overlap or the assets that you work with, then product sits squarely in the middle of three disciplines, right? Understanding our customers, users, and needs. And that might mean customer need or market need, right? You might also need to understand the technology available in order to build towards those needs. And then third piece, understand the needs or goals of the business. How do we fit into the industry landscape? If the business doesn't need this, but you meet the technology or customer requirement, then what happens? We don't propel growth. We don't monetize. So how do we use this as a function to grow the company? So product uses this holistic understanding to partner with design, engineering, and marketing, as you guys mentioned, to take features from conception towards that vision to market, and then everything in between, right? Another way to look at this, next slide, is PMs effectively run the past. So if you've watched Hell's Kitchen, it makes PMs seem like Gordon Ramsay. That's not what I'm implying, but if you ever worked in a restaurant, you understand the person that runs the past is the person that helps people keep organized. And even before that, maybe sets a certain vision and a standard, right? So little known fact, not on my LinkedIn profile, I actually went to culinary school for a while. Stopped going because with Asian parents, they freaked out I was going to culinary school and they thought I was going to make no money, which is probably true. But the term running the past, really, it could be occupied by the head chef. It could be occupied by the designer. It could be occupied by a restaurant manager. So I'm using this term to at least say, how do we connect and communicate and help people running well once we have this vision or set goal in mind? And because they sit in between the front of the house and the back of the house, you're effectively managing your customers' needs with your company or business's needs. You're that mesh that allows you to operationalize that vision that you want to deliver. So what does that look like when you look at multiple orgs? Next slide, please. It doesn't look the same everywhere. I mean, that's the simplest definition I can give you. And if you look at the PM job description, depending on the size of the org or the industry, it's very different. You might be a product manager or you might be a program manager. And you might be more of a project manager at the end of the day. In a startup, typically they don't have a product manager. It's the CEO and the CTO saying, hey, we should build something. We're trying to take it from 0 to 1. So the CEO or the CTO wear that hat. They define that strategy. They define how they're going to go about launching that first MVP, right? So depending on the needs of the team or the org, you might play anywhere between a more advisory role to a more project manager role, because your job as a product manager is to make sure we ship the right thing and we help my team or our team accelerate towards that goal, because you're that hub in the hub and spoke model, right? But having said that, the other reason why it's so different is because it's still a discipline that's maturing across industries, right? If you guys, have been in the space for a while and, have heard about product management, bootcamp and whatnot, all these things are relatively young in the last decade or two. And as the role matures and figures out how it, best supports a team into developing a large feature or a platform or a company goal, this will start to evolve over time. But let's go a little bit deeper on the next slide. So what do product managers actually do? What do they really do? So we're going to focus on some core competencies before we go into details. So going on to the next slide. So if you look at software development lifecycle, and we see this is a double diamond method around discovery, design, develop, and deploy. This is probably something that you're very familiar with. So as you would expect, PM should be partnering with you throughout this entire process. Next slide. So if you look here, you're looking at pieces that you're probably very, very familiar with, whether it's like diverging on ideation, going to addressing changes in the scope. These have ramifications for how you might actually develop your finalized product ship. So with a PM partner, we won't go into it too deeply just yet. You would want, for better or for worse, something Kevin will go into later, we do have to figure out how to traverse this together. If your design goals and your product goals aren't well aligned, then of course, this process doesn't work out well. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, clearly this is where we would overlap. Next slide. Okay, so in that discovery phase, the initial of the 4 phases, the 3 areas that obviously come top of mind, right? So in exploring and defining the users or business problem, we have at least these areas to consider so that we work through the development phase, and even after launch in an iterative fashion. Doing this sets us up well for success as we launch more beyond this foundational research for how we're scoping the problem in the first place. So we focus on understanding the problem together, whether it's competitive research or knowing industry landscape changes, what's been done, what hasn't been done, in order to align on why we build it in the first place. And you guys all know context and why sets the stage up for accountability when it comes to the team feeling like they are empowered to deliver. Next slide. So this phase is actually my favorite phase. So in the design phase, as you know, it allows me to work really closely with product designers and engineering leads to iterate on how we might build that thing that we had planned out, the thing that we spec'd out as being the solution. So it's a chance for product to play a more supportive role. The expectation is, as your counterpart, I'm able to help you shape what you're designing towards by sharing my industry standards knowledge, my competitive intel. How do we think of it from an API program, from engineering perspective? How do we see this scaling? So how can we create that market differentiation together to inspire the team to build something, maybe not just for the V0, but the V1? So if I provide that framework to you as your partner, that allows you to have the creative freedom to design exactly what we want to build. My job as an effective product manager isn't to tell you exactly what you need to build. If I come to you with a user flow, a mock, a balsamic, and I say, hey, can you guys just make this pretty for me? It kind of handcuffs you from being able to explore the possible options that we can pursue. And at the same time, you know what? We're going to go suboptimal on this. I'm going to just give you one person's vision for it. So this phase is really, really exciting for me as a product manager because it says, hey, these are the constraints that I'm seeing. What do you see from a user experience perspective? What is the right approach when we factor in technical considerations? Next slide. And if you guys have questions, again, just mentioning, feel free to just add them in a chat. So we go into development. What's really undervalued is the role that product and design teams play with engineers in the development phase. In most organizations, you'll see that design winds up being relegated to playing a supportive role where they say, hey, can you tweak this? Can you just give me the error screens for these? And the truth is, it's farther from the truth if you want to build a good product. So most often than not, things don't go quite as scheduled or as planned. So you'll realize that the design you had is something that engineering said they can't really execute within the time frame. So how do you create creative solutions around that problem? Or you discover something as you're designing or building it out that maybe it doesn't make sense within the overall platform or products ecosystem of user behavior. So how do we create solutions effectively while we're developing this product before we go to GA in order to make those tweaks to help land a better first launch? So since we're well entrenched and working with each other in the earlier stages, QA is also best supported by this collective team to make sure that we're doing it right. Is it the right behavior from a engineering perspective? Is this what I expected when we actually put these pieces together from a product perspective? And as a designer, like, does this user flow still make sense with the constraints and compromises we made? And then finally, of course, going to market. Like, product works with marketing and sales to align on that go-to-market plan, because now we have to shape that narrative. What is a story that we built out in order to make sure that adoption is high and discoverability is high? And then the last phase is deploy. Okay, we ship the product. Now what? Most of the time, I'll be very honest, product managers early in the career too will pretty much pack up their bags and be done with it at this point. I shipped it, give me a promotion, give me a raise. But it's overlooked, right? Because what happens is, how does a product actually land? How does it set you up to truly validate your assumptions and the design and the engineering effort that went into it to say that I built the right thing? Does the next phase of my roadmap make sense? So I'm sure many of you had experience with products where you ask yourself, this product would have been so good if they just did one other thing, or why did it end right here? It's probably because of that team, most definitely the PM, not stopping for a second to say, hey, it doesn't end here. What should happen next? How should I measure that this is doing the right thing, and what's the next logical action? So growing adoption around this, like growing adoption, optimize and iterate, is the most important thing, if anything comes to bear in how we launch a feature, because you need to drive the business forward. So if you join a startup after this and you're working on helping them, launch, XYZ features on a large platform, this is how you set up yourself for success and grow your team and hire more designers. So this is a key consideration that maybe isn't part of the core development process that I would actually challenge you guys to make sure is a priority in your minds moving forward. Next slide. So if I can leave you one takeaway about what a PM does is this, like, PMs are only as good as their team. So as long as they go through all the action that each phase reviewed earlier, the most important job of the PM is their ability to foster partnership around these shared principles to develop the right thing. It isn't about telling you the specs. It isn't about agreeing that this is the final design we need to get to. We have reviews, we have product reviews, we have design crit sessions, we have all these vehicles in order to have those conversations. But a PM should be a strong partner with you to help you understand what are the main principles, drivers, guardrails, in order for you to have the rules in which you can actually flex creativity under.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for that overview. And what I really love about Jay's philosophy is that, he definitely embodies this in his day-to-day work as a PM at LinkedIn. I had the privilege to work with Jay on one of his first projects here. And I think that's actually really critical. Like, a lot of the stuff that Jay kind of covered, you don't actually learn in design school. I never learned this when I was in my master's program or an undergrad. And these are things that you kind of figure out as you're working. But I think it's really important for you to realize as students, like, what kind of organizations do you want to work at? Do you want to be at one where you're very collaborative with product? Or are you okay with being more like as an executional partner on the design side? Lots of different advantages and opportunities in terms of those different types of organizations. So with that being said, what I'm going to cover now is more of the overlap between PMs and designers and how we work together. So I think what is really important about a designer's experience, especially if you're kind of looking at one of these in-house companies or a large tech company like LinkedIn, is that product is going to be one of your most important partners in design. I think it could actually make or break your experience as a designer. Having like a really well organized PM and somebody who's very highly collaborative can be a lot of fun. And then in some instances, you might not be so lucky and work with that great of a PM, which Kevin will share some of those stories later on. So just to kind of cover at a high level, what is the role between design and product? So everyone has its own focus and its own organization. typically within design, we're taught to be in school and, through our practice that we should be very user-centric and thinking about, the people who are using a product and what's that best experience for them to create those levels of efficiencies and create delight in our products. And product managers typically are usually think about the business first. So they're very thinking about the metrics, what's going to drive the ROI, how can the business generate revenue, and how that relates to each other. But what's really close in reality is that there's a little bit of both that we have to do. Like on the design side, you can't just design something without thinking about the business. Otherwise, people might not actually take your idea seriously or think that it's actually implementable because there's no business ROI backed by it. But on the product side as well, you can have like the best business idea, but if users aren't keen to using your product, you're not going to succeed either. And then what's even closer in reality is that then there's that third level of engineering, which we're not really even covering in this presentation. But what's really important here is to understand the intersectionality of technology. With all the things that we do as designers, you have to think about the users, the business, but then you have to think about the feasibility of technology and to partner well with engineering to build it. And on the same side, engineering and product, they have to think of all three angles as well in terms of how to execute to make something successful. So ultimately, our jobs as product managers and designers is to create a quality product. We basically want the company to succeed and we want our users to be happy at the end of the day. So what does that mean? What is a quality product? So at LinkedIn, we have a framework that you see here on the right-hand side in terms of how we define quality. And it's really an intersectionality between user value, business goals, and being well executed. And that's really the key spot, to have all three of those things in order to build a quality product. So with that being said, I actually want to pause here and see and open it up to the students here. Can you think of a product that is not quality? Maybe something you've used or you've seen businesses like fail because they didn't think through all three of those areas? And if so, if you can think of an example, can you tell us why? And I'll flip to the diagram here, if this will help as you think about quality.
I have an example.
Sure.
In my work before school, I used a piece of software called MindBody quite frequently. And I would say that it is not a quality product because of the multiple sub programs that you had to integrate with MindBody to even make sense of the data that was inside of it. And also its reliance on training versus solving the problems through proper design. And that way, I think from a user's perspective, it actually doesn't help you do what you want to do. So it wasn't executed well.
That's a good example, Scott. I've used MindBody as a person trying to sign up for classes. I find it extremely confusing too. So, but they found a sweet spot in a business value. There's not a lot of organizations tackling these things for like health organizations, but you're right, it's not very well executed. So good example. Anyone else here? Come on, somebody's definitely got to have used a crappy product recently.
If nobody's got one, I'm going to mention one that was just in the news. Quibi. You guys probably heard about that $2 billion company that got shut down. I'd say that business goals were great. User value could have been great, but execution was really terrible. Nobody wants to go to a separate app to sit 10 to 15 minutes to watch a video when it could have maybe existed in Facebook or somebody else. So, oh man, it's just a lot of money sunk into a program that didn't quite work out.
Yep, and I see a couple in the chat. So Canvas, banking apps, Snapchat. Snapchat's an interesting one. Nikhil, do you want to give us your thoughts on why you don't think Snapchat's doing so well?
It just like, as a user, it never clicked with me. I mean, the usage, like, for me, Instagram is that one place which, I can utilize it for multiple purposes, uploading pictures, creating stories, but Snapchat just, as a person. So I don't know in much detail, but there was something that I was saying, like, that this company has been evaluated far more than, it actually like its actual worth. So maybe you guys can actually shed the light on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent one. I think when they hit the market, they had like found something niche at the time with user value, but as competitors have caught up, like Instagram and Facebook, they actually gradually lost that user value over time. I would agree with you on that, where like Instagram just basically killed their market share. So now they're really trying to struggle to retain that user value because it seems so redundant to other apps out there that actually more people have like usage on the platform. So that's actually a really, really great example there. Maybe we can take one more. Maybe can someone think of one that had good user value and was well executed, but really poor business goals and did not survive?
Oh, I have one example, but I'm not sure.
Yeah,
So,
no, it's okay. Go for it.
yeah, so I have used the Otter frequently. I'm not sure whether you have know that. It's a recording. It's a recording app for like making the transcripts during the interview. So I think the function is really good, and also like it's really easy to use. But all the documents inside are kind of mess, and I can't see what's the business value of this app, and I don't know whether it still make a profit for its business.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's thanks for sharing that. That's really great. And then I also see in the chat Uber. So lots of very interesting thoughts here from the students. Really appreciate you chiming in here. But I think in all these examples, you guys called out very excellent points. Like in a lot of these products, some of them are more well known than others. Like they might be kind of succeeding, but some are flailing because they really lack one of these elements to make it a core quality product. All right, so just moving on here. So we talked about quality, right, in terms of that framework. Now, how does design and product fit? We overlap on top of that. And what ends up happening because product and design, we both overlap and care about quality, but focus on slightly different things, is what happens is that we can actually have tension. So not 100% of the time you're going to agree with your product partner because everyone has something that they might be focusing on. And with that being said, it's totally okay. You're going to have a lot of confrontation that you might have to deal with any organization. Tension is totally normal between product design and engineering. But what's important is to have a healthy level of tension so that you can make a product better, so that everybody has a voice at the table. So with that, I'm going to share it now to Antonio, who's going to cover more in detail in terms of how to work with PMs and how to embrace that tension.
Yeah, thanks, Christine, for telling us how product teams and design teams work together. I'm going to dive a little deeper into like how you can work with PMs and some specific measures you can take to make the collaboration successful. Next slide. So I do have to say, working with PMs, some pairs work much better than others, and it really depends on how well you're vibing with the other partner. Next slide. So I've only been at LinkedIn for, it's my 3rd month now. And from day one, I had to collaborate with my PM to get my details on what kind of projects I'm going to work on and how we're going to move forward. And I've also really felt that it's really important to learn how your product partner works. You know, does your PM like to just jam on a Zoom call these days, or create a Google Doc and write things down with you? Do they want to do more structural approach to creating a product, or do they go with the flow, and are they like open to experimentations and stuff? You really have to get to know your PMs and how they prefer to work, and finding that balance is a good way to start it off properly. Next slide. And we'll share some good tips on how to collaborate with your PMs, some tips and tools. So some of the tools you can use are these kind of things. You might not have seen these before. To be honest, I didn't know any of these 3 things before joining the company. But the first thing, product requirement doc, that's like the one document where you and your PM collectively come up with a document that states all the necessary features and requirements for that product. So it's like the go-to the source of truth when you're designing something and you're confused. Oh, what feature did we need to put in this page, or what pages do we need again? This is a great place to go back and refer to. And the good thing is, like with Google Docs and everything, it's really easy to add comments and ask questions to your PMs, even like other product partners too. So you can always tag your partners and build this document together, which is great. Another thing is one pagers. I've seen this being used when our project scope got a lot bigger than before, and we had to include more partners into the project. A one pager that summarizes what the project is about really helped other partners get on board a lot quicker than before. So this is another tool you can use. Strategy docs describes more about what's the go-to strategy for this feature and how do you make this successful. So depending on the situation, you can leverage different types of tools.
Can I ask something before you move on?
Yeah.
Who builds those documents? I don't know. Like, is that something? Okay, got it.
Yeah, Jay is raising his hand. Jay, do you want to chime in a little bit?
Yeah, so typically it's a product manager that writes all three of these, or primarily authors. If you look, even just glancing at the mock that's on there right now, it says things like NGRFC, I see Figma file, things like that. So you can see that this winds up being a collaborative source. It winds up being the source of truth for all teams, but it starts off with a product manager generally putting the end state vision, the strategy, what's the opportunity, things of that nature to help frame, as well as like near and longer term goals. That way people can contribute to it together.
Awesome,
yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and Luigi, I'd like to add, sometimes you might actually work in a situation where the PM doesn't write PRDs, and I've seen designers actually do it, especially like at startups or smaller companies, or you know, maybe they're just like their PM's just very disorganized. But that's when design can actually chime in and come up with the PRD as well. At the end of the day, a PRD basically just dictates like what are the use cases, what are the user needs, how we're going to achieve some of that. So there's a lot of shared knowledge between design and PM there.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And oh, is there someone else?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, and some of the tools that designers can actively leverage is shared platforms like Figma. Figma, I think, is great because you don't actually need the software installed on your computer to view the files. So the biggest benefit is you can create your mocks, create a prototype, and then quickly share the link to your PMs, your engineering partners, and none of them have to have Figma accounts to be able to view them. So that's one great tool you can leverage. Another technique we use a lot is rolling decks, primarily on Google Slides. When external partners have to join the project and they're like, so what is this project all about? It's always good to have a rolling deck that's constantly updated, so they can skim through the deck and really see what the background context is, what the process has been so far, and so on. And lastly, prototypes. Nowadays, like Figma has really powerful prototyping features. So things that were pretty hard to describe before with static mockups and series of mockups, now it's really easy to share them, again, by a link. So there are a lot of tools these days that help you with collaboration with other partners. And another important thing is meeting with your PM often and as early as possible. So what I like to do with my product partner for my project is every week we have a sync up so that we all share our process. My PM kind of gives me update on what kind of uncertainties have been cleared up or what's still up in the air. He always gives me updates on, I know we agreed to create this feature, but some logistical parts are still moving and are uncertain at this point. So you can go ahead and do other ones first. That kind of conversation helps me prioritize what to design first. Having a jam time. So if you see a product description on the Word document, you might not actually easily visualize what that feature might look like. So you can have like a jam time together, just doing quick sketches on Post-it notes, just kind of brainstorming what this feature might actually look like. And, inviting people to office hours or design reviews. You can hold, I've been into like several office hours at this point where a lot of product partners, a lot of multiple PMs, multiple engineers, multiple managers, multiple designers coming into office hours, just really discussing about the future of a certain feature. And it's not even like writing a document or something in that call. It's just really having a discussion about where we should go. And that's been helpful to clear up some uncertainties. And inviting PMs to your design reviews. Sometimes like designers, because we are really fixated and we live in Figma for so long, sometimes our designs look fine to us, but not to the product partners. So it's really important to invite them if possible, but also like share the designs regularly with your product partners.
Hi, Antonio, can I ask one quick question before we move to the next slide? So
Sure.
if you can go back to the collaboration slide, actually.
Oops. Sorry, go back here. This one?
No, the previous one for this. So
Okay. Here we go.
yeah, so you mentioned that Figma the tool, like, which is a standard in entire LinkedIn. I'm assuming like, LinkedIn also would have other offices like, across different countries. So it's a great tool for collaboration. But one thing that I felt when I was using this was, how good would you rate this for like, managing a design system? Sketch comes out as a more powerful alternative, like, because you can manage your symbols, components and all. Were you able to, so how do you go around with Figma? And do you guys have like a design system? How do you manage it using Figma?
Yeah. That's a good question, Nikhil. So yeah, so we actually just transitioned to Figma earlier in this year, and luckily in time before COVID, because we were using Sketch and InVision, and that made it really hard, especially in a remote context, to just collaborate and have multiple people working in there. Now, as an organization, we're 100% on Figma. That's not to say that that's the only design tool our designers use. You can also use like Framer, Principle, any other prototyping tools that you might need, or After Effects if you want to do some advanced animations. But I would say like 95% of your day-to-day, you're going to be mostly in Figma as a designer. When it comes to design systems, we actually, design systems team actually does integrate into Figma. They create something called a library, where there's like particular components that they have built out by different folders, whether it's like iOS or web or something like that. And we can actually just pull those from the library directly into our Figma file. And then that way they can also push updates out to us pretty easily. I think it's been pretty easy because when we were in Sketch, we had to use an additional tool called Lingo on top of that. And that was actually a big pain for designers because then we had to use 3 tools versus now everything's in one.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Yeah, and that being said, question to everyone in the call. When you worked on your team projects, do you have any collaboration tips that have worked well?
Miro. Virtual whiteboarding is the key.
Miro? Miro, right? Yeah, I think I've used that tool once too. It's really easy to collaborate and sketch out ideas and stuff. I think I really like that tool too. I remember. Anyone else?
I like end of day meetings just to see where everyone is.
Yeah, sorry, you said just checking in with everyone in the end of the meetings?
No, in the end of the day, like every day. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, especially I felt like after I had a lot of cross-functional meetings, we talk about a lot of things in the meeting. And after the meeting, I'm like, so what were the key takeaways again? Thankfully at LinkedIn, the meetings are oftentimes like the important ones are well documented. So you can always go back to see the documentation. But yeah, doing like a recap after a day is definitely helpful. Do you want to do one more?
I feel so rudimentary on this, but I've worked for several companies, all of which have had really small teams. And I think having some sort of personal connection with the people that you're working with makes the actual work life or the like working relationship a lot better too. So, you know, just actively taking the time to know who you're working with on a personal level. I just feel like the collaboration happens a lot more smoothly when that's the case, like in real life if possible.
Yeah, definitely. The funny thing is, when I interned at LinkedIn last year, I interned in the San Francisco office. And for full-time, now I'm in the New York office. So it's within the same content experience team, but we have 2 locations. So essentially, I got a new manager, new peers, new mentor, and everything. And you know, while I know all the people, I haven't really met them before, the New York team. And once we had Kevin and I actually we went to like a small gathering, a socially distant gathering to kind of chill. But for me, it was important because it was my second time after 2019 seeing Kevin and some of my New York teammates. And after I met them in person and, you know, chatted about different things, life in general, I feel like I'm clicking a lot better with the team after that. So definitely, thanks, Brenda. And yeah, we're gonna now move into working with a good PM with Kevin.
Thanks, Antonio. Thanks for running through all the different collaboration techniques and how to work with PMs. So I will now tell you my stories about working PMs. Worked with a fair amount of PMs, worked with some good ones, worked with some not so good ones. So I'll tell some stories there. And the things I value. I'm actually working with 2 PMs right now. I just started on a new project. You know, I love working with PMs so much, I can't get enough of it. So some of the things I value about working with a good PM is a lot of things that Jay went over, which was, you know, a good PM is a really great facilitator on the team. They really improve communications between not just, you know, you and the product partner, but also engineering and marketing. There's all these different stakeholders and functions, and really having a quality like PM that's that center and that nexus to communication is really, really important. So that's one of the things I value the most on it. And my current PM's really good at doing that. Or one of my current PMs are, well, they both are, but the one I'm working with mostly, I should say, is like really, really good at that. She's really great at keeping everybody informed, really communicating things that, you know, they're hearing from leadership, new challenges that are arising, whether it's like resourcing challenges or partnership challenges. And I would say that's probably like her superpower, which I think is like a really amazing thing for a PM to do. The other thing I really, really value on a PM is when they're really inclusive and bringing people early on into the process. My PM is really great at that. We were working on a project a little while ago, and we did this thing called a funnel analysis, which what that means is you look at your product and you see the journey of the user over time and where the gaps are, where they're falling off. And so, for instance, there was this one part in the funnel, and she brought the team together, engineers, design, marketing, and said, this is the area we're going to focus on, this piece right here in the funnel, because this is the biggest pain point we're seeing, the biggest problem we're seeing in the data. And what's great about that is, you know, she didn't come in and say like, this is the solution, you know, here's the problem. She really just pointed at the problem, said like, this is what we're seeing, this is the focus, what are some ideas? And by framing it that way, what you do is you open it up for everyone to be involved in that, you know, not just design for me to be like, yeah, okay, I'll go do some concepts, I have some ideas for how we could solve that. But engineers can get involved saying like, well, you know, maybe we can tweak our like relevance model or change this, you know, to better solve that problem. So really leaving that open-ended and bringing everybody into the process early on is, I think, one of the strongest things that a PM can do. They're coming, you know, to the team saying like, these are the problems we're trying to solve. These aren't just the solutions. So having that that flexibility is really important for bringing everybody in. Next slide. So what we'll talk about though is dealing with conflict. You're gonna have disagreements with your PM, like it's just gonna happen. I've never 100% agreed with a PM on everything. Sounds like a dream if that happens. But it's really important to find different ways you can work through those disagreements and make sure that they're healthy and you're not slowing down the entire team in the process just because you can't get past that. So some of the most effective ways to do that. Next slide. What I tell designers to really focus on is really focus on your framing and how you communicate your designs and your process. It's absolutely critical for getting buy-in, for having people understand your thinking. And this isn't so much about dealing with conflict as it is avoiding conflict, and really trying to have people understand that. It's critical in an organization, it's critical with partnerships everywhere. Really, really focus on that. And it takes practice to do too. You're gonna have a lot of projects you work on, and not everything is gonna be like this super amazing, like innovative thing. Like there's a lot of design maintenance work, but even in those smaller projects, I tell designers to really focus on their framing and practice their framing that, because even in those projects that might seem a little obvious, if you focus on how you present it and why you're doing it, you can then hone those skills. So then when you do something that might be a little not obvious as a project or feature that you have to really persuade people and have them understand why you're doing it, you've had practice doing that in other projects. And then next slide, Christine. PMs need to do this too. That's an important thing for both of you. I've worked with some PMs that were great communicators that would, whether it's through a PRD or document or strategy doc, they've really outlined their thinking and why they think this is the opportunity. It's easier for us to be bought into that too. And I've had PMs that don't do any of that and they're terrible communicators, and it makes everything really hard to really understand both sides there and how you guys are actually going to move forward. So next slide. So there's some other ways you can work through a disagreement. The first thing as a designer, it's okay to say no, and whether this is just from a bandwidth perspective or whether this is from a principle perspective, something you think that harm the user. Hopefully you're not working with any PMs who do anything to harm the user, but just know that it's okay to say no, especially on like your resourcing and bandwidth. Sometimes like engineering resources tend to be very meticulously calculated and allocated. Design resources tend to be treated a little bit more malleable. So it's okay to really understand your process, learn your capacity, and know when you can say no, and that it's okay to say that. Another way to get through disagreement is just asking the team. Sometimes there was a project that I worked on where me and one of the PMs like couldn't get past like an agreement on like how big a button should be, and we like really could like it should be this big. It really shouldn't. So one way we got back through that is we actually just asked the team. We brought in, other PMs, other designers. And what was helpful there is that it's not always going to get you past it, but sometimes if there's like an overwhelming, choice in one direction, it can help kind of just minimize that for people to kind of disagree and agree to disagree and just move forward. So there's some ways you can ask the team too. Another way too is also bring in some of the more neutral parties like user research or data science. If there's data that can help inform the decision or research that can help inform the decision, that can also sometimes quell some disagreements and move forward. And the other one is what we call escalations at LinkedIn. Escalations is a process where if two people disagree or two parties disagree, they can both have a document together where they can both put their perspectives down, and then they send that document up to leadership, and then someone in leadership sees both perspectives and then just makes a call based on that. Generally, this is mostly product managers just escalating against other product managers. I haven't seen too many design and product manager escalations. Design and product can usually work that out. But interestingly enough, the one time I saw a designer escalate against a product manager is actually how I met Christine. Because one of the PMs I was working with kind of went off and made like a decision. It didn't really include Christine's team in the process, unbeknownst to me. And then, so when I met Christine for the first time, she was like, "Do you know about this design and like why this was implemented?" And I was like, "Yeah, I heard your team agreed to it." Turns out that's not true. This is the first time I ever met Christine. But what was great is that was actually a good example of like design, just like having a principled stance of saying like, this is not how, we do this on our, respective surface that we own. There's other ways to do that. If you want to do this, you have to kind of work within like our framework and our guidelines. My kind of like disagreed on that. They escalated against each other. And thankfully, we ended up actually going with Christine's stance. So that was actually a great example of design and products escalating against each other and then having that stance and then getting through it through leadership.
Yeah, and we're good friends now, right, Kevin?
Yeah, I know. Now, yeah, exactly. I love that story because it's like now we're buddies. Cool. So working with not so good PMs, which is a great segue from that escalation story into this. So for all the reasons that I like working with a good PM, the opposite is why working with a toxic PM is probably more than any other role can really bring down a team, because the PM is so central to being that nexus of communication through all these functions. Like they can really inspire and motivate a team, but they can have the exact opposite effect and create a really demotivating environment, a very uncollaborative environment if they're not great. I worked with a PM that was like this. They would make decisions unilaterally, not communicate very well, or bring people into the process. They would like impede communications between people and try to like put each function into a silo and not have the team be brought together. That escalation that I just talked to, that was like a decision that was kind of made unilaterally. I had no idea that like the team didn't agree to what we were doing because I trusted my PM when he said, yeah, they're fine with it. You should trust your PM. But it turned out that was not the case. So there were some good lessons though learned working with this person and this PM. I learned to really be proactive here because there wasn't really a lot of collaboration or a very collaborative environment going on. So the only way I could, further ideas or concepts was really be proactive and do that myself and really socialize that outward. And that was another really positive lesson learned, is that the more you socialize ideas, so it's not just like you and your PM or you and your team working and then like, your PM is just like, no, we're not doing that. No, we're not doing that. If you socialize it beyond just your team, other partners can see that, other teams can see that. They can recognize some of that stuff and ask questions about it and be like, oh, we're actually working on something similar. This would be great if we can collaborate. Or, oh, we've been wanting to do that forever. So really learning to be proactive and socialize things was a really positive lesson learned from working with someone that, was not going to collaborate with me. Next slide, Christine. So it's a two-way street, being a good design partner, you don't want to just, blame it all on the PMs here. There's some things you can do too, to make sure that you're a good design partner and how you can collaborate. Antonio went through some of that with, some of the features you can do to make sure your designs are accessible and collaborate with your PM. But some of the things and strengths that a designer has in the next slide is being a really good facilitator. Is one of the probably most powerful things you can do as a designer. A lot of times when there's brainstorms or workshops or design sprints, I've seen a lot of designers, myself included, really lead that process and bring the team together. And in that way, don't just totally rely on your PM to always being the one that has to rally the troops. You can help out with that and really set the goals for the session and how you can actually move forward there. Next slide. So one way you could be a better designer when working, or a couple ways you can be a better designer when working in PM is, make suggestions to the product, don't just do. Similarly, like how Jay was mentioning that a good PM doesn't just tell designers what to design. A good designer should also be proactive in the product strategy, make suggestions to that. You don't want to set yourself up for that relationship where you're just waiting for the PM to tell you what to do. Which leads to the next one, is to be proactive, communicate often. Another thing there too is you don't want to get in a situation where you don't talk to your PM and you go like off into like your own world and design things and they have no idea what's going on and then you just like appear with all your designs suddenly. Bring them into the process early on. Right now I'm working with one of my PMs. We're literally starting on a doc together, just outlining what are the user needs we're trying to solve for, what are the potential opportunities, and then we're going to transition to that into like a Miro whiteboard where we can kind of jam together and ideate. So really make sure you're communicating, you're being proactive and working together. And the last thing is also make sure that you can raise issues and ask for help too. Nobody wants to, be in a situation where people aren't aware of the problem and it kind of just like festers. Raise those issues early on, ask for help. It's okay to ask for help, especially if you're like stuck. There's been times where I've been stuck on a problem where it's like, I can't get past it, or I've hit a wall. Ask your PM to collaborate with you. That's a really good way to, they have just as much stake in trying to solve this as you. They're great thought partners. Next slide. And I think now I'll hand it over to Jay to talk about his experiences working with a good design partner.
Thanks, Kevin. So now that we went through this huge section about how you work with these strange creatures called product managers, I'm going to talk about what my experience has been in terms of like working with a good designer. I'll also call out that I'm not giving a section about working with bad designers. So just for future presentations, we might think about that. So working with good designers, it's funny. So the assumption we make when we talk about any of these stories is that each of us as contributors to building a business, to building a product, our core competencies are already being met. You're a great designer. I can write great strategy docs. I can figure out what we should build. Like the assumption is those things exist. So with those assumptions is this other focus that we're talking about here today, right? Where in my mind, great designers communicate really well. They ask tons of questions like Kevin was mentioning. They are really good at running with empathy and tell a great story. These are narratives that I expect a good PM to also have, but that's what I expect from my designer. And ideally, they optimize for the best solution and they don't necessarily bias or bring biases to the solutions they come up with. And a keynote is like, as I'm talking about this one story, it's very simple for you to fall into that bias when you're talking about consumer products and applications because we use it on a regular basis. So you have a tendency to say, oh, we should do it this way because it's great for me, but maybe you don't optimize for the whole. And that's where it creates a bit of tension, of course. With B2B, it's a little bit different. So my example is actually with a designer in the past year. He and I are working together around this one new feature, which he's never really ever heard of because one, it's somewhat novel and unique to the space. But two, when does he do digital advertising on his days off? He doesn't sit there and optimize marketing campaigns, right? So when I went to him and I said, hey, this is a product feature that I want to build. This is the user flow that I believe it would fit into well. These are some examples of what competitors are doing, just high level. His immediate questions were, okay, so how many users or personas, what's the audience that we would have on our current platform that would actually use this feature? Is it everybody or is it a subset? When you say competitive products, are there other examples I could look into? Can you give me links? Who should I be looking at? So he went through this phase of trying to understand all the context I had in the back of my head beyond what I gave them in the PRD or the brief to see, okay, how can I best educate myself to be in the same conversation or same language on how to approach this feature? And then he actually asked me like, hey, what do you think this feature should look like? It's zero ego in terms of like, okay, I'll find the most optimal solution. I'm Leonardo da Vinci. It's going to be amazing. He said, hey, what do you think it should look like? And we had this frank conversation where he invited me to be a part of that process. And he valued the institutional landscape business knowledge I brought to him to help him focus on the areas that he should double click into. So he went about exploring the space and realized there was a fundamental problem. In order to build this feature the way we wanted it to, we actually had to change some of the information architecture of our overall platform because it just didn't make sense in terms of consistency. So his ability to see the forest for the trees allowed me to actually take a step back as well. And when I talk about him, it's in a very glowing light because he is a great counterpart to me as a product manager. We are literally the same coin on opposite sides. He's able to look at the other part that maybe I haven't thought of, and he allows me to give a contribution that he probably wouldn't have thought of because it's not his primary goal. I can give him the funnel analysis. I can tell him how our users are behaving on the platform. I can tell him how the industry is shaping up when it comes to using this feature. I can also tell him what we're going to build 3 years down the road that leverage what we're building right now to give him that context. So the expectation is for him, we're learning how to talk to one another. And when we challenge each other, he would come to the conversation with things that, you know, make sense to me in terms of like my ontology. He says, hey, this is a competitive analysis user flow. Here's a wireframes. How do you think about that? He might talk to one of our biz ops people or our data science people and say, can you help me pull these numbers? So he comes to me with the language that I need to better understand where he's coming from. And vice versa, I can come to him in the same way and say, these are product experiences. I'll take screenshots of a ton of things and say, hey, this is very consistent. Would we not want to do this as well? So it's kind of like, you know, when you watch that movie or the TV show and you're just thinking, oh my God, can they just tell each other what they're thinking right now and just take care of things? Why don't we do this in real life? And of course, in TV shows, that would end the movie at 10 minutes and the TV show would just be canceled after one season. But the expectation is, how do you bring your technical skill set, the language that you use, and translate into a way that your partner can understand, so that when he goes on vacation or I go on vacation, I can trust that you can be the best leader for the team so that we represent each other's needs, right? And finding that ultimately lands you in a place of trust. All these things we talked about, these tools, socializing offline, the end goal is to get to that point. And frankly, you know, I've had great experiences with a lot of designers at LinkedIn because that's the mindset. This is a collaboration. This is complementary. It isn't about you versus me, but it's like, how do we build the right thing? And here's my data-based decision-making in order to help us get us there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christine.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing all of these wonderful stories. I see we have a few questions, so we'll get to those soon. This is the last slide of the presentation. But I think this is just what I want to leave with all of you, some really key takeaways, that being a good designer or product manager in this instance is being a good partner, and it takes effort. And I think what's really interesting, if you guys think about what we presented in the content here, almost everything we talked about is soft skills. Never once did we say being like super good at Figma or knowing all these different design tools is actually going to make you a good designer. Those things get your foot in the door in terms of getting a job, but accelerating in your career and doing a really good job as a product designer, it's a lot of soft skills here. So here's some key takeaways around some of those things. So what should you do, right? We talked about asking lots of questions, gathering research and data, sharing your designs early and often, and being flexible is really important. Being receptive to design, leaving your ego at the table, and being proactive in communicating. These are all really important things, no matter what job you decide to go into, is going to help you there. Some things that I think is important for designers to think about is like, don't expect the PMs that you work with know how you want to work with them. I think it's really important, and I love Brenda's comment earlier, it was about establishing relationships with people. That's super important in any career, any industry that you go into. The other thing is, don't ever present your designs without a clear goal in mind. As a design manager, I can tell you how many design reviews I've gone into where the designer didn't set up the goal and they just walked through the designs really quickly, and then coming out of it, they were super confused because they had so much feedback from all these different people that didn't actually help them make a decision in terms of what to do with the design. So I think it's really important to lay out those goals so that you can be more successful coming out of design reviews as a designer. Don't just do what you're told again. And like, also, if you're getting stuck, don't keep issues to yourself, and don't spend too much time trying to resolve issues. I think that's part of our job as managers and other people in the team, like Kevin said in some of his examples. You're going to have conflict. And if you can't figure it out, it's totally fine to escalate. It's not like a bad thing. It's just basically how you can move forward to make sure that you're not stalling progress. So hopefully with that, this was an insightful conversation with all of you. Really appreciate you all listening in here. And then we'd love to open it up for Q&A now. So I'm actually going to stop sharing so we can see everyone. I know we have a few questions in the chat too that we can take. So yeah, let's do that. Okay, maybe we start with some of the questions in the chat first. So one of the ones earlier is, does LinkedIn follow Agile framework with their teams and projects? Jay, do you want to chime in a bit here?
Yeah, sure. So generally speaking, yes. I think when you're a small company, a startup, you can actually go fully agile. But the nature of the business and the fact that we represent multiple business lines, that's why I'm saying generally yes. So for example, our LinkedIn Sales Solutions is one line of business and they do a quarterly release. While they might develop and release code for the quarterly release in an agile process for Sprint by Sprint, they don't actually push out the feature set until the end of the quarter. LMS or LinkedIn Marketing Solutions, we do generally follow the agile process. The part where I say generally is where we have, constraints around design allocations, data science support, where we might have to, stagger this to be like a quarterly launch in order to make sure the resources are coupled up nicely. In dedicated teams, you certainly have it, but generally speaking, yes.
Great, thanks, Jay. So we have another question here in the chat. So Kevin, you mentioned that designers have to follow the working guidelines provided by PMs. My question is that as a designer, you might face sometimes situations you should fit yourself into the work plan of the team. Do you have any good tips around your experiences at LinkedIn or other places?
Yeah, I'd say it's not so much following the guidelines of PMs. I think it is about working yourself into that team and just having that be, a relationship between you and your PM and how you work. Like sometimes the PM will be like, this is the strategy and here's loosely what we're going to follow, and that's okay. Be part, like, you obviously can't just be like, well, I don't agree, I'm not going to do anything there. Work with the PM on that. But at the same time, good PMs will also recognize that design can, explore other avenues too, if get ahead of things. And then sometimes, design can come back and say like, hey, what about this? And then PMs can pick that up too. So I think it's more about just having that relationship be fluid between you two, and it's not like one person guiding the other most of the time. And I think that's been largely my experience at LinkedIn, which has been really great. Is I can explore ideas and put them on the table for things for us to consider. PM can do that. Engineers sometimes can do that too. I think that's really what's great, is when everyone can really feel like they have a voice to solve that problem you're all focused on.
I think adding on top of that, especially for projects like mine, which has really tight schedule and it's evolving super fast, sometimes like PMs don't have enough time or resources to fully spec out what we need to build. And oftentimes I would just do some design explorations myself as well and bring it to the meeting and show. And then the PM, my PM partner is like, oh, this is actually a really good idea. I have another idea going off of your design that we could probably include in the spec. So I think it goes back and forth and keeps evolving together. And I think that's something really great.
Yeah, for sure. One analogy that I learned when I was in consulting that I think is kind of helpful for people to think about here is when it comes to pushing back in relationships, right? Like, you don't want to be the person who's always saying no. You want to come off as collaborative, obviously. But if you think about it, like, you might have a pocket full of marbles, right? And those marbles represent favors that you might ask of individuals. So you can ask for particular favors, such as pushing back or saying no, or, like changing the direction of something. But at some point you run out of those marbles. So you need to think about what are some other ways you can collect marbles back for them? So it becomes a balancing game, right? So sometimes you might say no to your PM around a feature, but throw them back a bone, right? And suggest something that is close to what you're trying to achieve, but maybe is better because it's backed in some sort of research or data or something like that. And sometimes, pulling those things can actually help you gain more marbles so that you kind of establish yourself as an individual and that is a constructive person when it comes to like negotiating and thinking about particular concepts versus just having to say no all the time. Anyway, so then we have a few more questions here. We've got one from Sharon. Designers involved in setting business and product goals, where do we draw a line? Any insights from the team?
Probably Jay can chime in here. I'd probably say on the metrics for success side, that's firmly, I would say, in the PM world. I think product goals, it depends, because, when we get like product principles and stuff like that, a lot of times it could be, there's a lot of overlap with design principles. Like a lot of the product goals might also be goals for the user, and then it gets a little blurred. I wouldn't even say blurred, but like you can be very collaborative there about aligning on what are the goals for this feature. But I think when we tend to get into like the metrics for success, like, what's our true north metric, that tends to be firmly in the PM side.
Yeah, I agree with that. Generally speaking, if your product manager doesn't know what the metric of success is, you're in trouble. That's a simple way to say it. Because if you, for example, if you're trying to grow revenue with people signing up to a product or application, or alternatively, you're trying to grow just user engagement overall, you can imagine that the role that design plays in the initial goal setting will be a little bit different. But regardless, that PM should be setting the framework for how we arrive at the goal. We look at historical trends, we look at larger targets for the business and say, hey, this is what we want to align to. I brought up the example around user growth or engagement because it's likely that the design partner will have more of a voice in that process because UX, maybe there's just UX refinement rather than new feature that needs to drive that goal. So of course, we want to make sure that you're part of that process. But it isn't something that certainly happens in silo and gets finalized in silo.
Cool, thanks. Another question in the chat. As a PM, so back to you, Jay, what stage do you think it's ideal to involve engineering in the planning, roadmap, and SDLC phases?
Super early. You can't go off and design or decide you're going to build something and then set a timeline or a roadmap, and the engineering team says, oh, this is going to take 9 times longer than you expected. So, super early. So it's not like you involve the entire engineering team or the entire design org, but when you start setting those goals or roadmap, it's probably best to at least loop people in so we understand the right sequence we might even approach it.
Yep. And then next questions, how do designers and PM align on timelines? And how do you decide a project takes 6 months versus a year? I can chime in here for this particular question. So as a design manager, it's part of my job to really help define the roadmap for my designers and what we're working on. So the thing is, when it comes to aligning a timeline, it's definitely a collaborative effort between design, product, and engineering. Usually what happens is at the beginning of every quarter, we have like some sort of planning phase that happens where product comes to us with requests. And when I mean us, it's design and engineering. Then we prioritize them based on whether or not we think they would be like a good fit for the user needs or the products or things that we're working on. And we have a conversation around it. So sometimes we prioritize different things or we agree to the prioritization that PM sets and then figure out what's a good cadence that aligns to all 3 different groups in our planning process. Now, when it comes to deciding if a project takes like 6 months or 1 year, the way that I do the estimations is that it depends on the level of the feature. So if it's something like designing a notification or an email, those are usually pretty straightforward. They're the design might already have a set pattern or component in place. So that might actually take a designer a few weeks, like a couple of weeks, 2 weeks maybe. But if it's a brand new feature that we've never done before, it's a different use case. There's a lot of collaboration with multiple teams. That's when projects get bigger and they might end up spanning like 3 quarters or sometimes up to a year if there's multiple phases of that particular project. So that's more or less how we do that. Question on what is the design culture at LinkedIn around critiquing? So Kevin, Antonio, any thoughts around that?
Very collaborative. I mean, it varies team to team, but like I'll just speak about like our team on content experience. We have a great design critique culture. We call it critmanship, where we design each other's stuff. But basically, we have on the New York team once a week we have a design crit, and then on the wider like C team we have the San Francisco team, we have a wider design crit too. That's once a week, so twice a week. One thing I kind of miss actually a little bit about being in an office when we have those and went to those, is we did a lot of informal desk crits. We actually did a lot of informal desk crits where people just swivel around their desks and look at each other and their different designs. So I love that. Yeah. We have different frameworks we use. One of the frameworks we use for critiquing each other is called like, consider, try, and do. Tell people like what you like about the design, ask them if they considered other things, maybe ask them to try something, and then it becomes mandatory feedback, say like do this, talk to this team. So I would say the design critique culture is pretty great at LinkedIn, very collaborative. Antonio, what's your experiences so far?
Yeah, I've been doing this LinkedIn critique for 3 months in 2019, and then for third month now in 2020. So 6 months in total. Just logistics wise, I think our team, we have one weekly design critique within our New York team. So that's a really good avenue where I think like six or seven people, including our manager, comes in. And then since we all know our products really well, it's fairly easy to give like casual feedback about, oh, that's kind of cool, fix this. We also have an additional weekly critique where both San Francisco and New York team come together. So that's when things get interesting, where the two locations work on completely different sets of features, but we're still under the same umbrella of content experience. And we do another session of crit there. So I think that's good. Above that, we also have like several other crits. Some of them are like, do we still have show and tell, Kevin? I think show and tell was.
We do deep dives, Antonio.
Yeah.
So that's like at the executive level. So if you want to present designs in front of a bunch of directors and VPs, because it's like a really big feature, we also have those at those levels too that we encourage designers to go to.
Yeah. So when I was interning, like, I thought it was really helpful that there were all these different levels of crits you could go to and get feedback from, depending on your different stages of your project. Early stages, you go to like your local crits, and then as you progress through the project and gets more refined, you would take it higher and higher. And I thought that was really good, having multiple avenues.
Awesome. So the next question we have is, what is product ops and design ops? So maybe I can take the design ops. That's a good question. So that's a new field. We call them design program managers, specifically at LinkedIn. So their job is to really help us horizontally within a department get organized and like improve our processes and tools. So a program manager works a lot with design managers in the sense that they really help us with figuring out the timelines for when we're planning our roadmaps and all these things. And they give us those tools and ways of communicating. But then also they're helping the team too. So for example, if we're using Figma, but we're not using it consistently, they can help us with coming up with best practices and processes on collaboration, setting up access, things like that, and take that into account. So they're really in a supportive role to make sure that we operate and run effectively as a team.
And then product ops, we also have technical program managers, or product ops or POMs for us, product operations managers, help us with a lot of the getting to ship pieces, whether it's like owning pieces around getting user feedback and tickets and doing some market research, or collaborating with how clients are giving us feedback across products to help us like baseline within the org and see how we're doing overall, so we can improve the areas that are most painful or maybe create a new product enhancement. So very similar to what Christine mentioned in terms of a supportive role, but less of the program manager role that she mentioned.
Cool. And then we have another question here. Luigi's curious in terms of how does LinkedIn decide on changing or building new features in the product? Probably back to you, Jay.
So magic 8 ball is not the answer, but so it kind of depends. You know, like each line of business or product org, whoever the VP of product is, they obviously infuse a certain kind of culture to how they run their ship. But having said that, let's take a focus on just the LinkedIn marketing solutions team for just a sec. And similarly, actually, with the flagship. So we go through an overall strategy review on a fairly regular basis. When it comes to like, actually, let me back up. The simplest answer is teams are fairly autonomous in terms of figuring out how to make changes within their product to optimize their users' experience or the customer experience. Having said that, when it comes to how do we create that seamlessness or continuity as an organization to build the right products together and to fuse these experiences together, we do strategy reviews, we do quarterly reviews. We actually go through an OKR process where multiple teams talk about what we're building together. And we have things called dependent tickets, where if we need to ask the flagship or the main team around the consumer experience to build something to work well with what we're building, how do we unblock us and create a path forward? So a lot of it comes back to like, we set our roadmap, we understand what our high level strategy is as a LinkedIn, as within one line of business like LMS. And then from there, we create and own our bottoms up roadmap to fit towards that larger strategy with a huge amount of headroom for what you build. And then we set OKRs and people, get to actually understand how these things fit together. So it isn't entirely just bottoms up only, which in many ways Google used to be that way for a long time, nor is it Amazon where it's entirely top down, but it's kind of like, how do you meet in the middle, right? If you have this set goal, how does your team that's actually building it have the freedom to build towards like this larger vision that fits within that scope?
And
Yeah,
your
that's
team,
oh, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just saying, and you as a designer should be working, with your team and your product partner to really craft what that roadmap is from the bottoms up too. So you can, help, decide like from your perspective, where, should we do this feature? Should we not do this feature? And that's really what a lot of design is too, is some of the most consequential decisions that you can make as a designer is, should we do this or should we not do this?
Yeah, that's a great answer, Kevin. That actually segues perfectly to our last question in the chat, which is what's more about LinkedIn's innovation strategy. So are there cross-discipline teams searching for opportunities that influence the strategy, or is it outright owned by PMs? So maybe I can chime in with that first. So the answer is no, it's not outright owned by PMs. I think PMs tend to be the ones who are like maybe documenting it and like creating those like roadmaps and those PRDs, but it doesn't mean that they explicitly own it. There's a lot of teams that are influencing. We talked a lot about design and engineering. Those are two core inputs, but then there's a whole slew set of teams that we didn't even cover that provide data to us as design, product, and engineering to make these decisions. Teams such as, if you look at qualitative data, we have user research that supports us in our design org that we partner up with a lot on doing foundational research. We also have a team of marketers, product marketers that have marketing research embedded as well. And they're doing things like surveys or focus groups and going out talking to customers to understand like what things to influence them, the roadmaps. Then on the quantitative data, we have teams like data science, biz ops, which is business operations as well, dictating like kind of what the data is saying in terms of how people are using the product. Oh, and I also forgot product operations management. So that's like our support teams. So those teams are giving us like quantitative data and sometimes qualitative data too from support in terms of how the product is doing and what things we can better optimize based on like things like click-through rate, engagement, like a bunch of different metrics that we might be tracking internally on the team. I don't know if I missed any teams, Jay, like there's a lot at LinkedIn, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to the question of like what kind of org, and there isn't a wrong answer for this either. The kinds of topics we talk about, and the last few questions you guys asked, it's gonna fundamentally feel the way that you pick the company you want to work at. Do you want to work in a top down where there's just clear vision and you micro optimize within the space? Do you want to work in a bottoms up where it's more about full freedom, but you don't really know what the larger vision is? These are questions you should ask when you interview, when you talk to people. And to add on to what Christine was saying, if your question behind the question, Scott, is do PMs hold the ball or the bag when things go wrong? If the strategy just fails and it crashes and burns, LinkedIn is a very product-led org. And what they mean by that isn't that product managers are dictators and they get to decide everything that we do. And as Christine mentioned, this is definitely a team effort. This is a community-built product. But yes, PMs do hold the ball if things go south. We're responsible to make sure that everyone's voice is heard and we're making the best decision to move forward. Our value is, like I mentioned before, picking the right team, fueling the team to build the right thing collectively and set the right roadmap together. In a different org, design plays a bigger role and they're maybe more responsible, or it might be the engineering team, but at least as far as LinkedIn is concerned, the expectation is that PM facilitates those conversations to create that community consciousness for what you're building.
Cool. We've got another question. So if a PM happens to be leaving the organization mid-project, how or when does the new PM come in? How does the team continue to work without disruption?
So my newest mantra in the last year has been, as a product manager, if you're really, really good, if you can become highly valuable and not critical. So if in a good team, the PM leaves because they decided to, like, I don't know, become a sourdough baker because of COVID or whatever, your designer, your engineering partners have created that system of talking to each other and having that empowered voice that they can operate really well without the PM being there anymore. And I would say the same thing if a designer left or an engineer left. I'm curious for Christine or Kevin to add on, but at least in the near term, that would be the case. In terms of adding a new PM, the timeline, that's a whole separate headache in terms of resourcing and hiring people.
Yeah, I would say that's right, Jay. If it was a good PM and they kind of established some of those places, that's where I actually see a lot of the time, like depending on the feature, if it's designers actually stepping in a lot at that point where there is no PM, and maybe the design manager really kind of helps to shape that strategy and move the direction forward. If it's a more technical feature, then probably the engineering manager would step in at that point to really just kind of help progress and move that forward too. And in some instances, like if it doesn't really make sense, then we actually just pause the project until we can hire someone to like pick it back up and then make it a priority again. So that also happens too. All right, so we have 1 minute left. I don't know if there's any other pressing questions. Maybe if somebody wants to ask one, feel free to.
I actually do have one. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, go for
it. I like what you said, Jay, about considering what kind of company you want to work for, and whether it's bottom up, top down, or in the middle or something. So kind of as I said before, I come from working from a slew of really small teams where my role has encompassed a lot of kind of all of these pieces. Do you have any advice for people who are coming from smaller teams and maybe transitioning into something that's like a larger corporate space as to how they can maybe hone in their new, more specific role?
Yeah, that's a great question. Full disclosure, my wife is a design manager at Facebook, so she lectures me all the time about what I'm doing right or wrong and working with my design partners. So for better or for worse, it's all her credit and why I happen to be a halfway decent PM partner to design. I would say like many things in life, self-awareness is your number one like skill set in understanding where you need to grow into. So if you've done 9 different things or 9 different areas that we talked about, you should really like focus on trying to figure out which areas are you really passionate about, the areas that you feel very strong in that you want to double down in. If you go into a larger org, naturally you can't do 10% of everything of 10 things, right? So if you figure out the 2 or 3 areas that you love double clicking into during that process of talking to the team, not even the formal interview part, but back channeling those conversations, ask how much of a role design plays in those areas that you actually feel very strongly or passionate about. And that will dictate largely the amount of happiness you'll have, because you'll spend most of your waking life at work doing that area, right? So I would actually start from like knowing what you really, really want, and then figuring out how to find the right team to help you, optimize for that.
Yeah, that's a great way to end. Thank you guys for that. So with that being said, I want to thank everyone so much for your time here. I know you might have a lot of other questions, so please feel free to connect with Jay, myself, Kevin, Antonio on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to continue these types of discussions and like take any questions that you might have offline there. One thing is, if you could please just write a little message when you send the connection request, it just helps us to remember how we might have met you in this instance. But otherwise, we hope this was a very enjoyable presentation, and it was a good discussion for all of you to really understand how product and design collaborate together at LinkedIn. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you on the social networks and stuff, and good luck with your job hunts and everything as students. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you so much for speaking with all of us. I mean, this has been a really insightful conversation, and the focus on the soft side of the soft skills within work has been really valuable. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.